Right, good evening, everybody. Steve Freeman is going to speak now about the need for an English Parliament as part of our Republican Labour series, education series. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Carol. Here we go. So this is what it's going to be about, and these are the kind of points I want to cover. I want to talk about Ben's English Parliament and the arc of history again, and England's democratic deficit and transitional democratic demands. Now, what I do want to say is the reason I'm highlighting this particular point about an English Parliament is because people aren't this has not really been raised on the left. So it's an argument that people are not familiar with. And only in my opinion, it's going to be a very important argument. And we need to get our heads around it. And it is part of the Republican argument, as I will want to argue in the sense. And I'll say why I think this argument is important for us to get our heads around. Because in a way, it gets us towards republicanism in a sort of more concrete way. Okay, so let me begin then. Let me begin with the first point, which was Ben's English Parliament. So this is point number one, Tony Benn's case. Not so much Tony Benn's case, but I wanted to take it from his program. So in his 1992 Commonwealth Bill, it's clause 31, 32, 33 covers all this. And he calls for national parliaments, which makes sense in the context of his bill. So he calls for a parliament for England, Scotland and Wales. Notice that he doesn't include Northern Ireland because he's withdrawn from Northern Ireland as part of his bill. So he calls for these three parliaments, which are important part of a federal structure. So he wants a federal republic. That's his case. And it makes sense if you want a federal republic, there's got to be a parliament for England, Scotland and Wales. So logically, it all works. So then, of course, what happens is that in 1997, 1998, you get parliaments for Scotland and Wales introduced by Tony Blair. And you get the Good Friday Agreement as well at the same time. So you get a new sort of settlement. So in a way, the English Parliament has been, for some reason, left out of Blair's story. Now, thinking about it, an English Parliament would be necessary. Can you imagine this? I mean, how it might come about. But if Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales were to leave the Union, if they all decided they'd had enough of being in the Union, Scotland's not far away, Ireland's been trying to get there, Wales seems less likely, but there is a sort of move, there is a growing move for Welsh independence taking place. So if they all left the Union, we left on our own, then we'd have an English Parliament. So by default, because everybody else had cleared off. We're sitting there on our own, and like the Westminster is now called the English Parliament again. Supposing that we decide in England to end the Union in the way that I believe we should, then we will need there'll be an English Parliament we'll need to have. So in that scenario, there'd be an English Parliament also logically. If we're going to have a federal republic, by the way, as Ben argued, we have to have an English Parliament. And even in the last case, if England was going to be part of a federal republic of Europe, supposing we were going to get to the point where we wanted to rejoin a democratic Europe in something like that, then we'd need to have an English Parliament for that too. So in a way, there's a sort of logic that leads towards this idea that we might be going there. So I think Ben's proposal is quite far-sighted. And even if I want to modify it, as we did in a minute, we might want to modify it since then because Scotland and Wales has already gone that far, then that's where we're going. Now, the second one was to say, this is what I talked about and this is the thing John might have forgotten about, I don't know, but this was what we talked in, and I think it was talk number 4. The English Commonwealth would be an English Republic. The phrase one and indivisible is Marx's phrase. What he really means by that is you have one parliament. You have one republic he would call it, Marx would have called it a centralized democracy. Centralized because sovereignty is vested in the people, and you've only got one more law-making parliament. There's only one place that can make law for the whole country, and that is the parliament. That doesn't prevent us having 9 regional assemblies, which I said that we could imagine that the North East, London, East Anglia, the East Midlands, all these places, they could have regional assemblies, but they're assemblies, not parliaments. They wouldn't be making law. They'd be doing stuff, but they wouldn't be making law. They'd be feeding into the parliament. They'd be maybe making proposals to the parliament. So there'd be a link between them. But these regional assemblies, and then underneath those regional assemblies would be citizens' assemblies or some forms of local democracy. So in this version, we've got like 3 tiers, but at the top there's 1 tier. If you go to America, of course, all the parts of the federal, but they have different laws in different places, including the freedom to make historically racist laws in different American states. Okay, you know, and Marx always said, well, federalism can be reactionary if it allows all these reactionary places to come up with all sorts of reactionary ideas. So we just want one. We got 1 working class in England. We want 1 parliament. So that's taking up Ben's argument, but just thinking, let's think about England. And then the last point I wanted to make was I did want to think a little bit about because if you think about parliamentarianism, we tend to think of it in a very sort of conservative way, and people think, well, what do we want another parliament for anyway? We've got enough we've had enough of them for centuries, so why would we want another one? And so I wanted to give 1 or 2 examples of situations where parliaments, even the invention of parliaments, can have revolutionary implications. Okay, so here's one. Here's my, let me just look at my notes a second. Here's the first one of those. And I think I've got it in my notes. This is less well known, this one, the number 1, the Iraq War. Now, I don't know, possibly because it's not so well known. What happened in the Iraq War, in the run-up to the Iraq War, is that the Crown did not need permission to go to war. It doesn't need parliamentary approval to go to war. It does it under the royal prerogative, on the prerogative powers of the Crown. So Tony Blair did not need to go to Parliament to go into the Iraq War. He could just say, orders in council, we're in there, off we go, because that is the legal constitutional position. And that's what he was planning to do. And then what happened at the same time is that some Labour MPs, just trying to see if I can remember the name of one of them. I've written it down in my book somewhere. One of these Labour MPs decided that they would call a separate parliament across the road in Westminster Hall. Anyway, he was a former Labour chief whip, and he got the he decided to book this hall and have a kind of special parliament to discuss the war. And he got the former Bernard Weatherall, who was previous Speaker of the House of Commons. He agreed he was going to chair it. So there'd be a mutinous parliament sort of across the road where they're debating the Iraq War. Now, this is quite a rebellious thing to do in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, quite a rebellious thing to do. Now, what happened was that Tony Blair got so panicked about this or worried about this, he decided that he would, after all, change his mind and allow Parliament to vote on the Iraq War, which, of course, the Parliament then did. They had a debate and they got to vote on it. So they forced Tony Blair to almost change the constitution almost by getting Blair to come to Parliament. Now, of course, Blair knew that with the support of the Tories, he would just get the Iraq War through, but they did have to have a debate in Parliament by taking some form of direct action. Now, that's just one example. Here's another one, famous one, because when I read about this, it reminded me of the one called Pride's Purge. So in 1648, they captured the king. This New Model Army captured the king, and they were holding him, and they decided they wanted to put him on trial for war crimes, waging war against the English people, because he started the Second Civil War, and had, and all the disasters that came from that. But the Parliament had a lot of royalists in it, So Colonel Pride brought a troop of the new model army to the doors of the House of Commons. And when the MPs tried to get in to the House of Commons, he said, right, you're not coming in, you're not coming in, you're not coming in, but you can come in and you can come in. So basically the only people who went into the parliament were those who were prepared to put the king on trial, which is what they then did. So he excluded those, and it was called Pride's Purge, and the parliament was called the Rump Parliament because it was a rump of those originally rejected. So that was another kind of revolutionary action because the winning side wanted to put the king on trial, and they needed MPs to do that. And then in 1689, a third, 1689 might be, I'm going to check the date on this again a little bit, but when they were trying to transfer power from James II, this is the Glorious Revolution taking place. And how would they transfer power from James II? They didn't want to admit that William I wouldn't be a legitimate king because that ruined the whole lot. So they had to try to persuade James to resign so that they could say, oh, he resigned, so we've got a new king now, that's fine. So they didn't want to show themselves up of having overthrown the king. But anyway, they called this convention parliament in 1689 to, as it were, to rubber stamp their illegal actions in a way, you know, in terms of the line of succession, all those other things. So that parliament was convention. It's like a constituent assembly, you know, a phrase that Marie would be more familiar with in a French context, because they were also going to set up a new kind of new constitution. So constituent assemblies may be like illegal bodies. They're not got authority, but they're going to establish a new constitution. You could, if you went to French examples, Marie, just when the Third Estate set up I don't know if it was a Constituent Assembly in 1789, they did something like this. They they went in a tennis court somewhere and they called a new parliament, and that was again a revolutionary act. Yeah. And then my fourth example, just another example, was in 1918, when Ireland voted overwhelmingly for Sinn Féin MPs. They got about 80% of the votes or 80% of the seats. I can't remember which. George might remember all this as well. And those Sinn Féin MPs, they went and set up an Irish parliament. I think it was a Dáil Éireann, it was called. It was an illegal parliament. They had to retreat from that eventually, and it was sort of closed down. But for a while, they sat there and said, we're in this parliament now. We're not going to go along with the English, with English rule in Ireland. So the real point of me making this point is that sometimes parliaments come out of people taking power, people seeking direct action. We shouldn't just think that the idea we're calling for a parliament means that we're just calling for something purely passive, and that it wouldn't involve citizens in taking action to win that or bring that about. So I just wanted to sort of put that idea out at that point. So the call for English Parliament, which many people might support, could be something that comes out of direct action. Now, I wanted to do a little bit more of what I've called the arc of history again. We did this before, and I'm going to repeat it. Do you remember I did this one? I did this idea of of what was called the double negative.
Oh yeah.
And I did it with the idea that we had the English Commonwealth became the British Empire, and then the British Empire went back to another version of an English Republic. It was a negation of the negation. So something turns into its, and you can trace it through how that comes about. It turns into its opposite and dies, and then it's reborn again as something else. So my hypothesis would be that the English Parliament died in 1707. It was abolished in 1707. This is not really recognised, because what happened in 1707 was that the Scottish Parliament was abolished. That was called the Act of Union. So when the Scottish Parliament was abolished, Scotland sent its MPs down to London. So the MPs turned up and sat in the Westminster Parliament. And at that point, it was no longer an English Parliament, but it became a British Parliament at that point. Now, there's another subplot about whether when Wales came involved in 1532, but I don't want to go down there with that one at the moment. So when say that what happened was that and then from 1707 through the 18th century, we got a British Parliament. It was sometimes later called the Imperial Parliament as British Empire Group, because it was making laws for the whole of the colonies. And we now know it as Westminster. So the English Parliament died and it was replaced by a British Parliament. It was negated. The English Parliament died. Now, my argument, of course, is that the double negation means that we will see the rebirth of the English Parliament. And that rebirth coming after, I can't even see my own thing, must be coming after 1997, 1998. So this is a prediction. We don't know when the English Parliament will come about, how it will come about, when it will come about. We don't know that. But I'm saying there's a historical processing chain here. So I was thinking, well, if remember the democratic reforms I talked about before. So, you know, PR, if it was a horse race, you know, where should we put our money? So we could put our money on proportional representation at 2-1. All right. Regional assemblies 5-1. Reform of the House of Lords 10-1. Whatever prices we've got on these horses. And then the English Parliament would be the real outsider at 100-1, you know, because nobody ever heard of that one at all. So if you were going to back these horses to win this race, you'd never think of backing the English Parliament. But my prediction is take all your money out, sell all your assets and put it on an English Parliament at 100-1 and you'll win. That's my prediction. Because as the race goes galloping on, this English Parliament that's at the end of the race will come galloping through the field and will somehow appear at the front and appear to be one of the winners of the whole process. So that's my way of just thinking about the idea. So if we're going to argue for an English Parliament, it's going to be something that's quite unpopular on the left, and we're going to meet all sorts of arguments. So we need to have the idea that there's something predicted, something going for us to give us the strength of our convictions. That if we start to argue for this, conditions will be right for this thing to become a factor in politics. And because we've grabbed this factor strongly, then it gives us a certain power in the situation. So that's the power of the double negative. So hold on a minute. So, oh yes, then I was going to do the same sort of view by looking at the story of the Irish Parliament. So just sort of I'm just messing around with this idea. So here's another interesting story. So again, you had an Irish Republic in 1798. Well, it was called the Republic of Connaught. And it was the United Irishmen that attempted to establish this republic. I mean, they were looking to the links with the French to break away from England. Wolfe Tone was one of the famous Protestant Republican leaders of the United Irishmen. But that uprising for a republic was defeated. Okay, and as a consequence of that defeat, the Irish Parliament was abolished in 1800. So unionism was the abolition of the Scottish Parliament and the abolition of the Irish Parliament. So the Irish lost their Parliament. So it's gone. It's been negated. Okay, gone and disappeared. But then if we roll on, if we think through the 19th century, there was a struggle going on for what was called Home Rule. You know, there's Gladstone introduced Home Rule. There were various Home Rule bills that split the Liberal Party. So there was a struggle to get that Parliament back again. And then in the story, the one I mentioned before, the Irish general election, the Sinn Féin majority, the establishment. So the Parliament is coming back again in the form of Dáil Éireann. It then becomes the Free State. So it remains a Parliament under the Crown because of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The Irish had to retreat. So they got a Free State, but that Free State remained subordinate to the British Crown. You know, that happened. And then, of course, I think the last one was, I did check my dates. I think it was 1947 that Ireland became a republic. So we got to the Republic eventually. It started, it was lost, it was defeated, the Parliament was closed, the Parliament came back again, and here it turns up again. Of course, I put in brackets a Catholic republic because it wasn't a secular republic, Ireland. It was very much a Catholic-dominated republic. Okay, it's, you know, so that's a kind of illustrative of this kind of arc of history, if you like, this negation of the negation going on, and it's the one that I say is going on in England right now. Okay, so I then want to, my next point was to talk about the idea of, and I just kept, somebody said the word incipient, I like the evolution of an incipient English Parliament. I think the word incipient's pretty good. It implies it's something that's not recognized, just sort of beginning, creeping into the picture, just beginning to appear on the scene, and not fully recognized. Another word is beginning to happen, becoming just apparent to us, that even if we haven't seen it, here it's sort of growing up from somewhere else. So if the stories for the incipient English Parliament would begin something like this: Thatcher, this is the story I've been telling, Thatcher dismantles the social monarchy during the 1980s. That's the thing we've been looking at before. Neoliberalism, if you like, was to dismantle the social contract, which was the support for the British constitutional monarchy. And Ireland was going on in the 1980s. The hunger strikers, Sinn Féin was growing. And then towards the end of the 1980s, there was the poll tax movement. And I would say that's a kind of incipient republicanism in the poll tax, because it's masses of people, citizens coming out and organizing and refusing to be taxed, a bit like the Americans did when they had their revolution, you know, no taxation without representation. So there was all that sort of popular movement going on. And the big impact it had was on Scotland. So there was then in Scotland, people said, we're having a constitutional convention in Scotland to design we want a Scottish Parliament. So there was a whole pressure in the 1990s for a Scottish Parliament, as well as the pressure from Northern Ireland to solve the Irish question. And so the next kind of step is that, call it the devolution solution. Tony Blair comes in, New Labour comes in 1997. And they can see this bubbling under of democratic demands from Scotland, not so much from Wales, but this problem in Ireland. They need to settle that problem. And so they come up with the idea of devolved parliaments, and they come up with the idea of the Good Friday Agreement. They hope that this can settle the whole thing down again, restore calm, peace and stability. But the thing was that England is left out of that for no particular obvious reason why that is. And so in 1998, there's a campaign set up. Campaign for an English Parliament set up. Now, as far as I can see for this Parliament, it tends to be a kind of right wing. Originally, it starts out as quite a right wing thing. Maybe people on the right are taking this up a bit more. But as it's evolved, in my theory, as it evolves, it'll become potentially more radical in the situation. So, you know, it's got potential to become something else. Anyway, I'm not suggesting we join this campaign. I'm just saying the campaign exists. There are people campaigning for this. And then, of course, the next step of this crisis for me is the banking crisis of 2008. This is the new epoch that I've talked about of the degenerate social monarchy. So things are going from bad to worse here at this point. And in the course of this, by the way, during this period from 2008, Cameron's coming along, and Cameron plays the Scottish card to English voters, by the way. In the 2015 general election, Cameron says to the voters, and he's only got to win a few Liberal Democrats. He says that if you get Ed Miliband, if Ed Miliband and Labour Party win the 2015 general election, you're going to get Alex Salmond, your worst nightmare. That would be terrible. So Cameron manages to get English votes, to mobilise English votes, and he talks about something called EVL, which is English votes for English laws. So he's now started to talk about English voters need to be sure that English laws are made by English parliamentarians. He's going along the road of saying that that it's almost like there's going to be an English Parliament within Westminster, like English MPs in Westminster, they'll get a different set of votes. See, you know, there's an English Parliament hidden in Westminster, secret in there we never even heard about. And remember that Boris Johnson, as well as being Prime Minister of the UK, is also the Prime Minister of England. He's the equivalent of, you know, this is all barking mad, of course, but he's the equivalent in England of Mark Drakeford and Nicola Sturgeon. So he's the Prime Minister of England. We didn't even know that. We just never elected him as that anyway. And then I think you can also see, by the way, that there is this in England, this Brexit reaction that we saw was that the right were mobilizing this sense of English not having control. You know, the slogan "Take Back Control" is playing on this idea that somehow in England we got less control over things than we're controlled by Brussels and things like that. So I think that the right managed to mobilize this sense of lack of democracy into the Brexit vote. Okay, now we know it's a con, so I'm not saying that they were getting this right, but they played on something that is there. And so that leads on then to my England's democratic deficit that we talked a little bit about before. So this is the argument, and I think I have a quote here. Yes, I do indeed have a quote here in a minute. England has 85% of the population, so it probably and since England's a quite work, probably 85% of the working class in the UK is in England. So that's a really important. There's a really potentially very powerful working class in England. All right, but it obviously is not working because the Tories keep winning. So somebody's gone horribly wrong with that. But in potential, it's got the strongest, biggest working class. Now, of course, these Scottish and Welsh parliaments have made a difference. And I gave one example before. Well, I'll give one in a minute. Well, I give another one in a minute. I gave this example of hormone. I previously given this example to you of hormone replacement therapy. Whereas hormone replacement therapy is free in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, because those parliaments, which are more in connection with people, have made these things free. Whereas in England, you have to pay for it. That was so embarrassing to the Tories that they've now said that they've made a sort of minimum concession in England. And so now I think you can get away, they can call it, you have to pay in England, but not as much so as you did before, kind of thing. Now, there's lots of examples like this in social care, where these parliaments have made a difference to provisions in Wales and Scotland. And people can see that because of the more direct pressure. They've got proportional representation, among other things, in Scotland. Yeah, they've got more representative kind of parliaments and governments. So there are a whole number of examples like that. And we're going to go back to Professor Vernon Bogdanor, who is a professor of constitution. I mean, he's an expert in this, and he was writing an article in the Telegraph, and this is what he says. He said that this is what his assessment of it is. We don't have to totally agree with it, but we can see where he's coming over. Devolution, he said, was confined to the non-English parts of the United Kingdom. England, he says, though comprising 85% of its population, was not a beneficiary, but she was deeply affected by it. Devolution aroused English resentment at privileges being given to Celtic neighbours, parliaments enabling their voices to be more effectively heard, and governments enabled them to prize more money out of Whitehall. There was already a constitutional economic imbalance in favour of Scotland and Wales, overrepresented in the Commons, with their own secretaries of state in the cabinet and extra money under the 1978 Barnett formula, but devolution accentuated it. That he's showing, and he gets a lot of academic research to show that public opinion in England has been affected by this in this way. And again, I'm not saying that Scotland's getting more than its fair share. I'm not necessarily endorsing what he's saying, but he's saying the more general popular perception that this one-sided devolution, if you like, has left England out of it and has left us receiving a worse settlement, so creating a certain amount of reception. And John Denham, I mentioned that before, said, makes the point that England is the most centralized nation in Europe without a parliament. It doesn't have a parliament for English affairs. There's no publicly, he says, John Denham, that there's no publicly accountable English government. So what I'm saying is that England has a bigger democratic deficit than other parts of the UK. Not to say they don't have a democratic deficit as well, but this is a factor in politics, in popular politics and popular conception. So that's why that's why my 100-to-1 outsiders got a real chance of coming up on the rails, because there's something real going on underneath all that. So I now want to go to my couple of points. Won't say too much longer. Go for a couple of points before I finish. Okay, this is I'm thinking to myself, perhaps an English parliament is some kind of democratic demand. Well, it is a democratic demand. Is it a transitional democratic demand? And I'm thinking that the answer to that is yes. I've argued so far that Republican socialism, the Republican road, puts forward the idea that a democratic republic is a transitional demand. It's opening the gate towards socialism, towards a social republic. That's the sort of thrust of what we've been discussing before. So, and we've used the term transitional demand for republicanism. However, I think in England, although not in Ireland, and so this is only in England, not in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, I believe that an English parliament is transitional towards a republic. Now, let's have to think about that a little bit more than that. So that's the idea. If it is transitional towards a republic, if that's true, it might not be true, of course, but if it is true, then for us to, in raising the question of an English parliament, we can open the door to a republic. So that my argument would be, this is one of the important levers towards republicanism. And I thought I would illustrate it in this way. If you think of if they've got a demand for an English parliament and you're explaining the case for it, there's things that start to come into the question immediately. One is an English parliament. Would it be a constituent assembly? Because if you're going to have a new constitution, a constituent assembly is a special kind of parliament to decide a new constitution. So when you're talking about this, you can start saying, well, perhaps we need a new constitution for our parliament. And maybe the parliament should be like the 1689 convention parliament that was set up to take a new constitution. Perhaps that could also be there. So we're getting into that area of argument. Then we're getting into arguing about popular sovereignty. Who should be sovereign over the English parliament? Should it be the people, or should it be under the crown? So you open another argument about who's going to have control of this parliament. And then that leads you to the idea that it could be a republic. If it becomes popular sovereignty, the English parliament would be a republican assembly. So you get through all of these, you get into all these arguments about the case for democracy, the case for popular sovereignty, the case for a republican thing. So it goes back to the original thing, a unicameral elected annually by proportional representation with MPs elected accountable and recallable with, should say, an average pay. So you get back to all those democratic arguments. So PR's in here. I would argue, yes, PR, but we want a parliament. So the way of dealing with the PR argument is to put it in the context of a parliament. So that leads me, I think, to two more. Okay, one more. There is two more. Here we go. There is the Constitution Unit. Wrote quite a paper that I've got, and I could send it around if anyone's interested, called Options for an English Parliament. And they're doing a whole survey This is a constitution unit from one of the universities. I think it's probably, I'm not sure which university it is. They did it with the Nuffield Foundation. They did a whole report on the English Parliament. And so they started asking all these questions. What powers would an English Parliament have? How might an English Parliament policy be financed? Would there be an English government? How might the business of an English Parliament be organised? What are the implications would it have for the UK? How large should the English Parliament be? Should it have 2 chambers or 1 chamber? Should it be unicameral or bicameral? What electoral system should be used for an English Parliament? And where would it be located? Now, those are questions that we ought to be able to answer in making a concrete case. Obviously, number 7, proportional representation. Number 8, put it in the Midlands somewhere, put it in Birmingham or somewhere like, not in London, you know, so various things one could discuss about that. So my last slide is this. I'm going to end here, comrades. Don't know why that held up there. Crisis of democracy. So what I'm saying is this. I believe the English left is moving slowly towards democratic, the idea we need more democracy. And that's what that whole move about proportional representation is, that we saw coming through in Unite, for example, passed a resolution for this, and people on the left. So there is a consciousness, there's a crisis of democracy, and we need to come forward with some democratic arguments. But the one we're facing all the time is proportional representation. And that's the hard argument. Because if we start saying, some people argue for proportional representation and we're arguing for a republic, well, that's true. But that seems concrete, proportional. That seems like something practical and concrete, something you could do. Whereas a republic seems a little bit abstract, a bit too far in the future. So we're going to still argue for a republic, but we've got to deal with that proportional representation. So the English left does not recognise yet the case for a parliament or republic. So my argument is, if we put the English parliament into the equation, we can start to deal with the proportional representation argument in a more effective way. My last quote, my last point was listening to not Crispin Flintov's. You may listen to Crispin Flintov on a Sunday morning, not the Andrew Marr show. And I was amazed to hear John Donne, who's a Yorkshire miner. Don't know if your comrades have seen John Donne. And he was talking about this, and he said, oh, sorry, that's gone in the middle there, PR versus a parliament for England. So we're arguing for a parliament with proportional representation, right? So John Donne, last point is this. John Donne says, in the Andrew Marr show, close the Palace of Westminster. That's Place of Westminster, and it should read Palace of Westminster. Close the Palace of Westminster and put a new parliament in the Midlands. That was his idea. That's the most radical and revolutionary thing that anybody said, and I agree with that. So I think John Donne's got it right. Close down the Palace of Westminster. Maybe you could turn it into flats or a museum, I don't know which, and then build a completely new building in the centre of the country to unite the country together, elected by proportional representation, all those other things, and stop spending about 6 billion quid trying to rebuild the rotten Palace of Westminster and all its completely crazy, corrupt ways of being. So I think there is a strong case for an English parliament. And I believe that we've not used this argument yet, but I do think we've got to think about how we can use it. And of course, to know we've reached the end, but not quite goodbye. Thank you, comrades. So I'm hoping we can put that up for. Stop the share. Back to you, Carol.
Unmuted, right. Thanks very much, Steve. Another really, really enlightening talk, going back into history, back to the first republic and right the way through to the present day. Wouldn't it be marvelous if we could get an English parliament and a republic in a republic? It would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, we've got Mari has a hand up, and then George.
Yes, hello. Well, I am very moved by this. I imagine the process as it develops is going to call on aspects of everything we have seen and combine them perhaps every time in a slightly different way. But it is good to have this pattern, because if we envisage for example, an English parliament, even if it was never to happen, it opens the road for us to develop programs and visions and to answer the call of people for more democracy and the rest of it. So myself, I'm quite happy with all this. There is another aspect which concerns me, is that in each act of union, England was usurping the other parts of the British Isles. So it seems to me that it is no wonder when they had actually usurped everybody that they no longer themselves had an identity, because they had absorbed everybody else. So by depriving others, deprive themselves, which is exactly what happens to imperialism. And so I was wondering that this would be an angle which I can argue quite with energy, and I do not see it argued here, because of the Black Lives Matters and the anti-colonization and the bringing down of the statues and all that. There is definitely a public which is trying to understand these things. And up to now, I had not realized that obviously there is no parliament here, because Westminster is used to usurp everybody. Well, I do not have the right vocabulary, but I'm going to perfect it. And I would like to see more said about this if it is relevant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mari. George had his hand up as well. George?
Thank you. I see this process as a transitional process in stages. You've got the transitional process to an English Parliament on the one hand, versus the existing power structure.
Yeah.
You cannot just simply go and have an English Parliament in Birmingham and expect the power structure, which is the Crown, to dismantle it. So the question I would ask you is, would you have an act of abrogation of the acts of settlement? The two acts of settlement. That is the question I posed.
So let me just, okay.
To my mind, yes, the first priority is there's a vast, huge deficit of democracy, and an English Parliament would go towards relieving some of that. How deep this will be is a very open question. So, and also, how long will it take for the Westminster Parliament, which possibly would in the meantime be responsible for external affairs, foreign affairs and things of more global interests? How long will that take for that to demolish? I cannot see this unless, of course, the important thing is all this must be pushed from below. So I would think possibly even the first stage would be to set up citizens' assemblies as far as possible, everywhere you can possibly, and it's feasible to do this. And then work on regional assemblies. And then when you're setting up the regional assemblies, you would then set up an English Parliament. The problem I've got is, obviously, I don't think this will happen in my lifetime, but the problem I've got is how long will it take for the power structure, the crown structure, to demolish itself? That worries me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, George. Another very good contribution. Steve, do you want to come back to any of those?
Yes, I agree with what, first of all, what Marie said. Yes, I that's the way she expressed it. I think that's England dominated England. First of all, England dominated Wales. First of all, conquered Wales, and then it fought in Ireland and it fought in Scotland. The Act of Union with Scotland was a kind of deal between a section of the ruling class, but not the Scottish people. So they've absorbed it. The way you described it, Marie, I think that works pretty well for me. And so we have this cultural thing about what is, you know, English. What is English values in all of this? That's kind of that's all kind of lost in all of this. It's a distorted Anglo-British imperialistic. You know, the dominant culture in England is not really about England. It's about sort of Great Britishness. It's a kind of imperial thing because it's grown out of this absorption process, the domination of the islands by the English ruling class, not by ordinary English people, well, obviously, but by the English ruling class, and then that turning into the British Empire. So yes, I think that's it. There has to be, you know, I agree with how you argued it. It's not something that I don't know whether Maria, it's an interesting point, is that whether we who are born in England sort of are taken in by this in a way that because you weren't born in England, you can see it in a clearer way. I mean, I just don't know if that's true or not, but I see it could be that you're bringing a different insight to this whole thing. I've often found, by the way, that comrades who come from abroad, they get Republican arguments straight away, whereas in England we're struggling with it because monarchy is so part of our culture. We're born into it, raised under it, and all the rest of it, and we can't even see it sometimes, you know. So maybe that's true. I don't know. That's just a thought. So yes, I agree with that. And George asked some important questions, and the answer, I probably don't know the answer to those ones, George. I do think, though, that our idea of republicanism means that we've got to win. We've got to have a political party that campaigns for these things, first of all, and then there's got to be direct action, George, in the way that you suggested. If the Labour Party had adopted a policy of an English Parliament, and if it had this policy of citizens' assemblies and regional assemblies, that you could start setting. They could be set up then. You know, you and me and Marie and Carol can't set them up, obviously, but if you had a movement, you could. And it's the case that you get, at certain circumstances, you kind of get dual power. You get dual power between an English Parliament and the Imperial Parliament, if you like, the Westminster Parliament. You could have that dual power situation could develop in Scotland if the Scottish Parliament says one thing and the British Westminster Parliament says something else about a referendum or you could end up with a dual power between two forces. So I think that the point about republicanism is it's not about the Queen. I'll come back to it. It's about, is there a republic coming into existence? Is there an incipient growing republic emerging from below? And all we can do is promote that as a policy, as a program, and encourage people that will take that direct action. And that's a political campaign to be able to do that. The problem we've got is not only is the Labour Party not doing this, but the Labour left isn't doing it either. And they're not even doing Ben. And we're arguing that the situation has gone beyond Ben as far as, because even as I say, we already got a Scottish and Welsh Parliament that he was proposing in 1992 actually came about. So yeah, I don't. How quick will you see it in your lifetime? Well, Lenin once said, I think it was January 1917. I think Lenin said something like, "I'll not see this in my lifetime." So you won't see a Russian revolution. I think Lenin said in January 1917, "I won't see a Russian revolution in my lifetime." So he was wrong. And George, I don't know how long we'll live, George, or how long you'll live, how long I'll live. But we could all be completely wrong on that, because we can theorize this in a meeting of this type with a few of us. But if there are real movements, real things happening out there, then those things can move in a crisis situation in ways we couldn't even dream about, for reasons we can't even think about, for events we don't even know are going to happen yet. I mean, if you think back to the Iraq War, they did set up a People's Assembly against the war. I remember I went to some of their conferences. Okay, that was just anybody coming together who opposed the war. But you can see in a crisis that you could, if you were promoting the idea of citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies, that could begin to emerge out of a crisis. Just like in Russia, Soviets, workers' councils were set up and things like that in a crisis too, you know. So, but the thing is, we need to promote it and prepare for it, and that's got to be part of the program that we go forward. And the problem we've got is not only is the left not that interested in republicanism, but my argument here is that the English Parliament's Tony Greenstein could easily dismiss an English a republic as being some American, French, or Irish conspiracy against us, you know, which is what he was going to say. But I think the English Parliament is a more difficult one to deal with because it's more concrete, it's more closer to where we are. So I think at that point is brought towards republicanism. Now, you might say an English Parliament's got the word English in it, that means nationalism, you know. So there'll be that argument that we're dabbling in nationalism, they'll say, you know, because we mentioned the word English. But that's just nonsense. That's kind of ultra left nonsense. You know, there is a place called England, we live in it, so we have to deal with it. That's the point. And, you know, and Marx was very clear on that as well when he was speaking about this in the 19th century. When some French ultra left said something like, we're part of the Brotherhood of Man, we don't believe in nations anymore. In a speech to the First International, we've abolished nations. We're not mentioning the word nations anymore. Marx said, that's great. He said, but you spoke it in French, a language that most people don't understand here, said Marx in irony. You know, so it's all right to pretend nations don't exist, but then you're speaking in English or you're speaking in French, knows that they actually are a reality that we have to be able to relate to. So Marx wasn't a kind of ultra left. Just because you want nations to disappear, you can pretend they have, sort of idea. So I don't know if I really answered what George has said, and I don't know if necessarily there's an answer, George, anyway. But I do think you picked on the right questions, and I think they're ones that we have to think about even more.
Thanks very much, Steve. Marie's got her hand up again. Marie?
I like very much this trying to be concrete and trying to visualize more concrete things. Otherwise, Tony Benn and the program and so a long way away. But then with the Parliament, I saw the question of the average wage and so on. And there are MPs, Labour MPs now, who are talking about this. So it's very important. Just to finish this, I think George is right. It's got to be done by people. But so we are preparing for when people move, because this is none of us can do this. But when they move, we have to know what is to be done. And if we just sit around and say, well, people have got to do it, then we are not preparing. And I was very amazed by the way momentum in 2 or 3 days was created. People were looking for a center for the Labour left up and down the country, and they formed I don't know how many local assemblies, and anybody could go, but in general it was the Labour left, but they attracted a whole layer of people who were not Labour. and who wanted to vote Corbyn, though they were not in the party, the people who came to those meetings. So we are in a situation which is going to return to this. The people are preparing, and this was not a strike. This was a political movement. It was a very advanced thing. It was not just about wanting me wanting more of something. It was us organizing in order to bring change and political change around one center. And I believe this is going to happen again. And if it is going to be on other matters, but an English assembly, well, we intervene there and make the points. But I think there's a good likelihood that we can develop more ideas around this question of the English Parliament, and propose that we have to pose repudiation of the Acts of Union, that us, English, we repudiate these acts. Yeah, and then, you know, all the rest, like, for example, the anti-trade union laws to attract the other comrades from the other regions and the other nations. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Great, Marie. I agree with all that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We've had another really excellent presentation from Steve, and we've had some more excellent questions from Marie and also George. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight. And I'm now going to close the meeting. Thank you very much.